Fred Knelman devoted his life to grappling with the complexity and interdependence of issues. The last book he wrote was Every Life is a Story, The Social Relations of Science, Ecology, and Peace. In 2003, a few years before his death in 2007, I talked with him about stories from his experiences and about the stories that he used in teaching ecology.
I suppose one of the most telling stories talks about the power of the organic, of the living, over the non-living. And it's a Hindu fable. And it's about a philosophical argument between a stone and a pumpkin. And the stone is losing the argument because he's basically macho. He doesn't really appreciate philosophy, he's not able to argue, and in frustration he smashes the pumpkin and he says, "That's how to win arguments." And time passes, centuries pass. The stone is worn down till it's nothing but sand and blown away on the winds of time. But the pumpkin seeds grow new pumpkins every year from then on. Time is very important. Let me give you a personal story. I was asked to appear as a special witness before a hearing of the New Zealand Electricity Central Board over a dam that was being proposed in New Zealand. And this dam was on a river on which the upper part of the river on both sides were apricot farmers that had grown apricots in their families and their grandparents for about 100 years. And of course the dam would have totally wiped out all this farming area. It would have been flooded out. And the specialists, the scientists who appeared for the electricity company, did the traditional cost-benefit analysis, They said, let's take a base of 50 years. Now, how many apricots would be grown in 50 years? And what is the price of apricots? We'll even put on an expanding price. And they came up with a figure. Now they said, what is the value of the electricity we produce in 50 years? And of course it was 1,000 times more. And I stood up and I said, you have no right to choose the time frame. You arbitrarily choose 50 years. I choose 5,000 years. The apricots will continue to grow for 5,000 years when the dam is all gone. Now let's do the calculation. And the apricots are worth more than the electricity. So I thought I'd really won something there, It didn't change anything, nevertheless.
Well, isn't that always the case?
Land is incredibly sort of basic to the health of an environment. And I think it's quite remarkable that, again, a medieval Marxist, I think, said the following: "The man who steals the goose from off the common is soon sent to jail. The man who steals the common from under the goose is soon set loose." It's intriguing because then we had in the feudal age, we had the enclosures, and then green is the color of money and the color of the environment. And once it became predominantly the color of money, then the land was ultimately destroyed. Basic law of ecology is everything is connected to everything else. And as far-fetched as it may seem, if a butterfly sneezes, it alters the universe. But early medieval writers understood ecology. For example, there is a verse that goes like this: "For want of a nail, a shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, a horse was lost. For want of a horse, a rider was lost. For want of a rider, a battle was lost. For want of a battle, a kingdom was lost." Linus Pauling did a remarkable thing once on the carbon cycle. I was at a meeting where he had addressed them with this, in part, with this story. He said, when Caesar was stabbed on the steps of the Capitol by Brutus and others, he emitted one last gasp. And the gasp, of course, was carbon. We exhale carbon dioxide. And although you might not know it, there are 10 to the 23rd power, 10 with 23 zeros, the number of atoms in only 12 grams of carbon. So the number of atoms emitted by Caesar was just incredible. And Pauling understood the carbon cycle. He understood how those carbon dioxide molecules circulated and were absorbed and emitted and so on. And he was able to calculate with mathematical precision that every living person at that time had one atom of Caesar's carbon in their bodies. It's just fantastic. It really is what unites us. It's what makes us one collective species. In this notion of connections, that ecology is the study of connections, there is a true story. This was in the days when Rhodesia, Zimbabwe was Rhodesia, and Salisbury was the capital, and there used to be boats that took visitors to Zimbabwe, took them up the Zambezi River on a tour, and those boats had to pass by a hippopotamus spawning area in a sandy bottom, shallow part of the river. And on one of the trips, and it happened to be an American woman, got hysterical because one of the hippopotamuses came close to the boat. And when the boat returned, the president, Ian, whatever his name was, sent out a platoon, an army platoon, and they shot every single hippopotamus, including the babies, just wiped them out. Following that, a disease began to break out upriver. It was called river blindness, a terrible disease caused by a virus. It had always occurred downriver, but never upriver. And the World Health Organization sent some experts there. And they eventually came to the conclusion that the hippopotamuses in their activities on a sandy bottom churned up the sand, and it became a filter. And it filtered out the viruses. The viruses were carried by snails and it filtered them out. And that's why there was no river blindness upriver. So the hippopotamus had a role. They were connected. And I found that a fascinating story. In all my teaching, and basically I've taught two areas. I've taught the sociology of science, history, philosophy, and sociology of science as an interdisciplinary study. And I've taught environmental studies, which is essentially interdisciplinary. And I have found how powerful a story can be to illustrate quite a complex concept or law, more powerful even than an essay. And I'll just give you an illustration that applies to science. In science, the concept of limits is very significant. And this story is about British Columbia and about a big international paper company who wanted to build a mill that's right up on a group of trees that came down towards the sea. And it was native land. And the Indian chief and the chief engineer from the forestry company were on the beach discussing this. And the forestry engineer wanted to convince him that it would not harm their environment. And he thought the best way to do it would be as follows. He took a branch and he drew a big circle in the sand. And in the circle he put just a hole. And he said, you see, this circle represents our knowledge about environmental issues. And this little hole represents yours. And the Indian chief looked down at him and shook his head. He said, but what worries me is what you don't know is outside that circle. I thought that was a marvelous illustration. This is a wealthy farmer in England in the 17th century. And he had a large farm. And he had 3 lazy sons. And so he did all the work on the farm, and the sons did practically nothing. And he got more and more concerned as he got old, because he thought, the farm is going to go to ruin. The farm is my life. The farm is their life and their future. It has to be nurtured. And so he brought his sons together on his deathbed. And he says, you know I have a lot of gold that I've accumulated. And I said, yes. And he said, well, I've hidden it somewhere on our property. But I'm not going to tell you where it is. And he died. So the sons went out and they began to dig around. And all over the farm they dug and turned the earth over. And the produce just flourished. The farm was never more successful because the gold was in the produce, not in the ground.
Beautiful.
It's a beautiful story, isn't it? Yeah. Well,
I'd like to ask you to just give some background about how you have been an activist an academic activist,
I've been more than an academic activist
for all your life.
Yes.
And some of the early stories that I remember you were telling the class when we taught together years ago.
The one about my being arrested?
Yes, tell that story.
Yeah, right.
And also about you're going in 1972 to, I don't think you've told that story,
Right.
your involvement in that.
I've been, you might say, an unrepentant rebel or an activist, even as a teenager. And in 1970, I had a great honor bestowed on me because I got invited to an ecumenical conference in Geneva, in the huge ecumenical center there. And the only other person invited to give a keynote address
Margaret Mead?
Yes, Margaret Mead was the other speaker, and they put us up in a beautiful hotel in Lake Geneva. We became friends, and we spent a lot of time together. But when I came to speak, to give my keynote address, I was very lucky to remember a story which I thought was incredibly appropriate for that audience. They were bishops from all over the world, from every country in the world. And then there was a section in the gallery for observers from the Vatican. And my story went something like this. This was in 1970. I said in circa 1990 there was a great world nuclear war. And a little monkey, just before the war, had gone to sleep in an abandoned lead mine and slept through the war. And when he came out, he was just traumatized is the word, because what was forest was gone. There was no forest. And he wandered around aimlessly. He was totally puzzled. And then in the distance he saw another little monkey approaching him. And the other little monkey, as it came closer, he saw was feminine. And she had her hand behind her back, and they came face to face. And she held out an apple to him. And he said, "You're not going to start that all over again."
And how did the audience of religious leaders respond?
Except the gallery didn't think it was that funny. No. The other thing is, in 1972, again, I was fortunate. An organization, I can't even remember their name, but an international organization, decided to fund 40 invited scientists from all over the world to be a parallel conference to the first United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which was the conference in Stockholm. And I was very lucky, as I said, I got invited as one of the 40. And one of the humorous events referred back to Margaret Mead, because one of the speakers, when I went to hear her on a panel, one of the speakers was actually an anthropologist from Samoa. And he said the following. He said, first, we were overcome by the colonialists who tried to destroy our culture. But even worse was the invasion of the anthropologists. And she was on the panel. It was very embarrassing to her.
What did she say?
She didn't. She just gulped.
Well, that was when a separate book was written about the deliberations coming from your conference, the parallel conference.
Oh yeah, sure, there is a book written now.
Yeah. Now, I don't remember that happening subsequently at conferences, that there was a separate book written.
Yeah, this is...
Well, also, I remember you told me stories about your involvement, not only in environmental issues and social issues, but also in peace issues, very early on when you were a teenager.
Yes.
At school, where you... exposed one of your teachers as being a Nazi. How did that... I remember you were telling me about that.
I took as a foreign language in my program at the University of Manitoba as an undergraduate. I was doing liberal Bachelor of Arts, actually, even though I was a sort of a natural mathematician. I just took to it absolutely naturally.
And when was this? When were you at... what year was this? You were very young at the time.
Yes,
17,
I was
18?
I was born in 1919, so gives you an idea when it was, very early. And I came to my class one day after I had read the Winnipeg Free Press morning issue. And there was a picture in the Winnipeg Free Press of my German professor in a room with pictures of Hitler on the wall, and he was in the full uniform of a colonel in the German army. And that group were called a Bund. They were secret. It was just at the time when Hitler was in power and so on, and these were sympathizers to Nazism. And so when I got to my class, I lay across the door, physically lay across it. I went early.
The entrance to the
entrance to the classroom. And as each student came, I showed them the picture and said, we've got to boycott this man. And eventually we did boycott the class, but the campus police came, and then the actual police came, and I was arrested. And the following few days I appeared before a judge. And this is another characterization of me, incidentally. I find it impossible to resist. The judge was very stern with me and said, how could you do that? Do you know this man personally? Referring to the German professor. I said, no, but I don't know Hitler personally either. And that got me into trouble, and I was bound over. But I've always had this irresistible urge to make a final retort, no matter what the circumstances are, and it's got me into a lot of trouble.
Well, you've often, through your involvement in nuclear-related issues, and you've written several books about it and so on. Yeah, what did you call it? What was it called?
Nuclear energy, the unforgiving technology.
The unforgiving technology. Nuclear energy, the unforgiving technology. And for years, you pointed out the linking of nuclear technology and the development of nuclear arms.
Oh, yes.
And do you understand why there's been such resistance?
Yes, I
it seems
do.
as though there are many physicists who benefit from the civil nuclear energy.
Well, nothing comes closer to the definition of a cult. It's astounding. I was astounded by the revelations I got looking at the nuclear regulatory commissions, whatever they are, whether it's the Canadian one or the international one, the nuclear physicists, the programs in universities, the teachers who taught in those programs, they all shared a faith, a blind, unbending, unyielding faith that nuclear power was, required for the benefit of humanity. and they couldn't bear criticism of it. And I've never seen such a collective mindset. And of course what happened then is that the nuclear regulatory agencies permitted all kinds of transfer of information and materials to countries who were planning to make atomic weapons. And that's how India made its bombs, that's how Pakistan made its bombs, that's how Israel made its bombs. And incidentally, you know that Israel has just passed the UK in its arsenal. It's hard to believe that a small little country in the Middle East is now the 5th largest nuclear power. It's incredible. But they started with a French reactor, Dimona, and then they refused to join any of the international organizations for the regulation of nuclear power. And they built this huge arsenal.
And imprisoned...
oh yes, of course. Venano. I've written quite a bit about
Well,
him.
Canada also, you mentioned about Pakistan and India. It was a Canadian technology that was...
Can-do. Yeah. Yes, the Canadians were perhaps more irresponsible because Can-do was thought of as the jewel of Canadian technology, that it would earn incredible export funds, and that it was superior to the light water reactors, which are the other type. And so they could flood the world with can-dos and bring credit on Canada and make a lot of import profits and so on. And for a while, can-do did quite well. But gradually the problems and the costs began to mount, and nuclear energy began to fade.
Mm-hmm. Well, you found even within the peace movement that there was a failure to recognize the linking between civil nuclear energy and I think you were people resisted your linking of the two for some time.
There were people who were quite sound on the peace issue, but would not accept my criticism of nuclear power and would not acknowledge the connection, the intimate connection between civil and military nuclear power. Yes, there were some people like that.
You were also involved in the court case trying to end the circulation of nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed capable vessels in 1991. I remember we worked together on that. They're still coming, aren't they? Even the Abraham Lincoln is...
I appeared at the hearings in Vancouver, yes, to oppose it. It's what people would not accept, and the debate that's going on now about the U.S. so-called national missile defense illustrates this. Canadians and Martin, for example, I believe, rationalized that this is a legitimate act. It's defensive. And that it's not connected to this other aspect of American space weaponization, which was called under Reagan Star Wars. And what they don't understand is in the dynamics of a nuclear power struggle. And there's only the United States in 4 documents that are secret has stated categorically that it will not tolerate the rise of another power that challenges their dominion over the planet. They won't accept that. And there is only one country that is in that category, and that country is Russia. And so they have plans ultimately to fight a nuclear war and win a nuclear war with Russia. And they're operational plans. And they that lends itself to this debate about national missile defense. Think of it as two men confronting each other, one with a sword and one with a shield. The sword represents your your nuclear attack system. The shield represents your ability to defend against that. Okay. If you have a perfect shield and an imperfect sword, you can defend. But what the United States is trying to do is to have a perfect nuclear sword and a perfect nuclear shield. And that's why to have a system in Canada is not because North Korea might eventually be able to send a bomb against the United States. Nobody's going to send a nuclear weapon against Canada. We don't have that kind of enemy, and we're not that powerful. We are, and this phrase has been used by the Americans, we are a nuclear debris acceptor.
No.
Can you believe it?
Well, we're also a nuclear material deliverer because we sell so much uranium to the U.S. Yes. And you've often said there's a little bit of Canadian uranium in every one of the...
We also are the major supplier of depleted uranium, which is 238, which is used in armor-piercing bullets and which is definitely connected to radiation deaths. Yeah.
Both in Iraq, it was used in Iraq in 1991, and also Kosovo and Afghanistan, and now Iraq again.
That's right. So what the U.S. wants to do is to launch what is called a counter-force attack. That is, attacking all the Russian weapon sites in a surprise attack. But because they know that can't be perfect, they also now want, even if one or two Russian missiles, long-range missiles, escape that attack, it could wreak a lot of havoc. So now what they want to do is build a perfect defense system against those. And that's where the weaponization of space, and that's where missile defense is involved. And there's another reason for Canada. Canada has fairly consistently supported the nuclear arms control regime.
And non-proliferation treaty.
Yes. This is going to violate the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And eventually violate the keeping nuclear weapons out of outer space treaty.
Well, also, well, you were involved in a way in the World Court Project, where the International Court of Justice handed down a decision that the use or the threat to use nuclear weapons was contrary to international humanitarian law. And I remember sending something out to a group of activists that are working against the missile defense. And they said, oh, it has nothing to do with nuclear. And again, this goes back to what you were talking about in the very beginning, the importance of linking all the different issues. Because to consider this independently from the development of nuclear arms would be flawed. You wrote two many interesting books, but two that were directly related to this, in Reagan, God and the Bomb, and America, God and the Bomb. Yeah. And I was rereading it. Actually, my son is reading it too right now. But you compiled an incredible amount of information. What sources did you have in the States?
I was in California at the time, with the original time when I did the research, and I read the book again, or went through it again the other day.
It's sadly so relevant, especially your section on fundamentalism and various beliefs and the linking of that.
That book has had it's been very broadly distributed. Did I tell you the story? I was in a local airline flight in Australia on a speaking tour, and I was sitting in the plane, not a big plane. And I turned around just to say something to the two women behind me, and they had my book in their hands. They couldn't believe that I claimed to be the author. But let me go back to this nuclear power issue. What was the first major nuclear accident in the States? I can't remember the name.
The accident in the States?
Well, the accident, yeah. Was in the East.
3 Mile Island, where you were consulted in the that was in the 70s.
Well, that was funny, the 3 Mile Island incident, because after it happened, in the next few days, I had 201 long-distance calls asking me what I thought about it.
From the media? Was this generally from the
everybody,
media?
From all over the U.S., from the media and so on. It's the largest single number of long-distance calls made in a short period in Concordia.
But was it because you were one of the few that
Yes.
would be willing to speak out at that time against?
Yes, basically. Yeah.
Well, when did you publish Nuclear Energy: The Unforgiving Technology? Had you published that before, or that was in the 70s, wasn't it?
Yeah, in the 70s.
And 3 Mile Island was what, 76, 78?
It was around the same time.
So it was around the same time. Yeah. Was that why you were contacted because of that book?
Yeah.
And you also went to Russia. You had a special invitation to go to Russia very early on.
That was a marvelous experience. I was in England in 1961, and I was doing a postdoctoral study at the Institute of Education, University of London. And what I wanted to know was, did two cultures exist in Russian society as it does in American and Canadian society? Two cultures in this sense, in the sense of the original concept, that if you looked at people in the arts and people in the sciences, there was very little communication, and they appeared to be two cultures. And it meant that I wanted to take a trip to Russia. I didn't know exactly how I was going to finance it, but on New Year's Eve, 1961, I was invited to a New Year's party. And at that New Year's party, an American, that was the time when a lot of Americans who were involved in Hollywood, 2 or 3 quite well-known ones, who had been banned.
Oh, during the McCarthy era.
In the McCarthy period. And this man, I wish I could remember his name, but he's quite well known. He said to me, we have a wonderful project financed by Britain, by the government. We are going to be going to Russia, and we are going to be studying Russian culture. And we're trying to get Peter Ustinov, because it's going to be built around a man or a person, a woman, who goes to Russia and discovers Russia. And it's through their eyes of discovery that the film will be based. And I said, why Peter Ustinov? Peter Ustinov knows a lot about, I'm sure, cultural things, but he doesn't know anything about science, and science is very important in Russia. What you want, and I was a little drunk, is a Renaissance man like me, who knows science and the arts, see? And I didn't take myself seriously. But 2 days later, I got a call from this man.
So you replaced Peter Ustinov?
Beg pardon?
You replaced Peter Ustinov?
Yes. He invited me to be the key person in the film, and I went with the film group to Russia, and I had an incredible experience. It was just unbelievable, and unbelievable insights. And there was a man who was my idea of the classic stand-up comedy act. I wish I could remember his name. I will sometime. But he was very, very marvelous. He did an act like this. In one act, he walked across the stage, and there were a group of offices. And as he passed each office, there was a man standing in the door, and he said, I've come for my permission. And the man would say, you stupid oaf, you ass. Haven't I told you that you go to the office down the hall? So he goes to the office down the hall, and he says, I've come for my permission. And the man says, you stupid ass, you oaf. Haven't I told you it's the office down the hall? And at which point this guy just breaks out into tears, and he's standing there, and 2 men in white outfits, medical people come, and they're carrying him out across the stage, and he has playing a fictitious violin. And as he passes one of the men, the man says, "There goes the example of inhumanity." And he says to them, "You are the most inhumane society the world has ever known." And it brought the house down. They're very sympathetic to that. But he told funny stories. He told
Whatever happened to the film?
Oh, I'll tell you that part. By that time I was emboldened. I saw myself as, because there were going to be first 13 and then 26 programs, half-hour programs, all over the world. And I saw myself as a new superstar, you know. And on the flight back to London, the plane was almost empty, but there was a man, a very bedraggled-looking, slouching figure that slipped through it. I paid no attention to him. And we got to Heathrow Airport in London, and the plane taxied up, and in the distance I saw maybe 100 cameramen rushing towards the plane. I thought, my God, my fame has preceded me, you know. And they rushed right past me. And the man behind me was a very famous pianist.
Oh.
You know, the super famous Russian pianist. I wish I could remember.
Rubinstein, Arthur Rubinstein?
Yeah.
Actually, it was funny if it was, because at that time you mentioned you were in England in 1960. Well, I was in Paris at that time and went to hear Arthur Rubinstein play.
Anyway, and he was giving his first performance at Albert Hall, and they were there to greet him. But what happened is, when the next day we were going to have a showing for the small group involved, and we found every single frame of that film was spoiled. Someone had sabotaged it, and we didn't know whether it was the Russians or the Americans who sabotaged it. But the film was destroyed, was never made, never shown.
Really?
So
Wow.
my moment of glory passed. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we'll just...
A delightful story that the man who told the story about the inhumanity told the following story.
This was in Russia?
Yeah, in Russia. Two Russians meet, and they start talking, and they say there's going to be a nuclear war. And the other one says, yes, there's going to be a nuclear war. He says, what are you going to do, comrade, if there's a nuclear war? He said, I'm going to get dressed in my Sunday best, and I'm going to walk slowly to the nearest graveyard. And the other man says, why slowly? I would not want to cause a disturbance. Oh boy.
Fred Knelman devoted his life to grappling with the complexity and interdependence of issues, peace, the environment, and justice in its broadest sense, including human rights. He believed that the social movements, however, embrace separate elements of these issues and have largely remained multiple solitudes. His work had been visionary, ahead of its time, raising issues that were only recognized years later and warnings that were only acknowledged in retrospect. He received his doctorate in physics and engineering at the University of London in the UK. For years, he had been synonymous with the anti-nuclear and peace movements in Canada and throughout the Western Hemisphere. In 1959, he was the founder of the Montreal Committee for the Control of Radiation Hazards, the earliest anti-nuclear group. And in 1960, he was the founder of the environmental non-governmental organization in Canada, Citizens and Scientists for Social Responsibility, one of the earliest groups in Canada. In 1967, he created an interdisciplinary program, Science and Human Affairs, which dealt with the environmental and ethical implications of science and technology. In 1972, he was one of 40 scientists in the world invited to the Daedong Parallel Conference to the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm. In 1973, he was visiting professor of environmental studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And in 1978, he was a visiting professor of environmental studies at Santa Cruz University. In the 1997 edition of Who's Who, Knelman's many awards were listed and included the following: World Wildlife Fund Prize in 1967, the World Federalist Peace Essay Prize in 1970, the White Owl Conservation Prize as Canada's leading environmentalist in 1972, the United Nations Association Special Achievement Award in 1983, a special award for meritorious service to the cause of common security by the Canadian Peace Research and Education Association in 1987, the World Peace Prize in 1994, the World Federalists of Canada Meritorious Environmental Award in 1998. He was shortlisted for the Right Livelihood Award, the Alternative Nobel Laureate Award. He is the author of numerous books, including 1984 and All That, written in 1970, Nuclear Energy, the Unforgiving Technology in 1976, Anti-Nation, Transition to Sustainability in 1978, Reagan, God and the Bomb, 1986, America, God and the Bomb in 1987. The last book he wrote was Every Life is a Story, The Social Relations of Science, Ecology, and Peace. And subsequently he continued to publish articles on the ensuing wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Kosovo, and articles on climate change.